Amina was the kind of woman people often overlooked. Living in Mombasa, she carried herself with quiet dignity, always dressed in simple cotton dresses and a neatly tied scarf. She was not one to chase attention or adorn herself with expensive things. Her beauty was gentle, not loud. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried thoughtfulness. Yet in her own home, especially around her husband's family, this simplicity was treated as something shameful. Joseph, her husband, came from a wealthy background. His family was loud, flashy, and always eager to show off their riches. In front of them, Joseph would laugh at Amina, calling her too plain. At dinners, when his sisters wore glittering jewelry and his mother showed off her gold bangles, he would look at Amina's modest outfit and smirk. "You don't even try," he would whisper harshly, loud enough for others to hear. Every time, the laughter at the table would sting Amina like a slap, though she kept her eyes lowered. To outsiders, it looked as though Amina accepted her place in silence. But behind her quiet eyes was a strength no one noticed. She carried her pain inside, never answering back, never defending herself. She absorbed the cruelty, but she was not broken. There was something unshaken in the way she moved, the way she carried herself, as if she knew she was more than what they saw. While Joseph mocked her, the audience could almost feel it, that somewhere deep inside, Amina was holding on to a strength that would one day rise. Whenever Joseph's family gathered, Amina felt like a shadow in her own marriage. His mother, a proud woman who loved to show off her jewelry and expensive lace dresses, looked at Amina with thinly veiled disgust. "You couldn't wear something brighter? At least some lipstick?" she would say, her voice sharp enough for everyone at the table to hear. The sisters would join in, giggling among themselves, whispering just loud enough to make sure Amina knew they were talking about. Their eyes would scan her from head to toe, lingering on her plain kitenge dress and her simple sandals, as though she had no right to sit at the same table. At meals, the cruelty was worse. Plates filled with steaming meat, rice, and stew would pass from hand to hand, each family member serving themselves generously. When it reached Amina, what was left were scraps. A small piece of bone with barely any meat, a spoonful of stew that had already grown cold. Sometimes Joseph's sisters would pretend to forget her plate entirely, only remembering when the laughter had already begun. "Oh, did we forget you, Amina?" they would say mockingly, their voices dripping with false sweetness. Everyone knew it wasn't an accident. Instead of being treated like a guest, Amina was made to feel like a servant. She was the one asked to clear the table, to wash the dishes, to bring tea for everyone while they relaxed on plush sofas and gossiped about their neighbors. If she hesitated even for a second, Joseph's mother would snap. "What are you standing there for? Do you expect me to serve myself in my own house?" Amina, without a word, would quietly obey. She never raised her voice, never argued, never complained. Joseph, the one person who should have defended her, only added to the humiliation. He laughed along with his sisters, sometimes making his own cruel jokes at Amina's expense. "You know my wife doesn't care about style," he would say, shaking his head as if embarrassed to be seen with her. The family laughed louder when he spoke, feeding off his words like fire. It was as if mocking Amina had become a sport, and Joseph was their captain. What cut deeper was how easily Joseph ignored her pain. He never looked at her face when the jokes were made. He never noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, or how she pressed her lips together to stop them from quivering. Amina had mastered the art of silence. She sat there, small and unnoticed, her heart tightening with every insult, but her eyes steady, refusing to let the tears fall where they could see them. To anyone else in that room, Amina appeared weak, the kind of woman who had accepted her place at the bottom of the family. But what they didn't realize was that silence doesn't always mean defeat. Every cruel laugh, every leftover plate, every moment of being pushed aside only sank deeper into her memory. She carried it all inside her chest like hidden fire. While they mocked, she was quietly promising herself something they couldn't imagine, that one day they would look at her different. In those gatherings, Joseph's family believed they were breaking her spirit. They saw her simplicity as a weakness, her silence as emptiness. But in truth, Amina was learning. She was watching. She was storing every insult like a seed that would one day grow into something stronger than all their cruelty combined. What looked like meekness was only patience, and patience, in Amina's heart, was turning into power. At night, when the house grew quiet and Joseph finally fell asleep, Amina's real world began. She would slip out of bed slowly, so the mattress wouldn't creak, then sit at the small wooden table by the window with only a dim lamp to keep her company. While others saw her as silent and simple, this was the time her mind came alive. She opened her old phone and searched for free tutorials about business, marketing, and how to start small with almost nothing. She read about women in faraway countries who had built businesses from their kitchens, and each story lit a spark in her heart. Beside her was a small notebook, worn at the edges because she had filled it with so many scribbles and notes. In those pages, Amina's dream was slowly taking shape. She wanted to create something of her own, something rooted in her identity and her culture. Her grandmother, long gone now, had once shown her the secrets of African herbs, the neem leaves that healed skin, the shea butter that softened scars, the aloe vera that calmed burns. Amina remembered those afternoons in her grandmother's courtyard, learning how to mix leaves with oils, grinding herbs with a stone, and listening to stories of how African women had always known the earth's medicine. That memory never left her. Her dream was simple but powerful, a natural skincare brand that celebrated African herbs. She pictured little bars of soap, jars of cream, bottles of oil, all made by her own hands. In her mind, she even imagined what the packaging might look like, bright patterns inspired by kitenge fabrics, names in Swahili that carried meaning. She wanted her products to tell a story, not just of beauty, but of heritage. But this was a dream she could not speak aloud. Joseph would only laugh, calling it useless. His family would mock her even more, saying, "Look at this plain woman, thinking she can run a business." The thought of their laughter was enough to keep her quiet. So she kept her notebooks hidden carefully in the bottom of an old trunk, tucked under folded clothes no one bothered to touch. Every night, after writing down new ideas, she slid the book back inside, making sure no one would ever find it. Sometimes, as she worked quietly, she imagined what life could be if her dream came true. She saw herself standing behind a stall at the market, smiling as people picked up her products and praised the scent of the herb. She imagined women from her village using her creams and feeling proud that something so pure and natural came from their own land. In her daydreams, she even pictured her own small shop, with shelves lined neatly, her name written boldly above the door. The thought made her heart swell, but then she would hear Joseph turning in his sleep, and reality reminded her to stay small and silent, for now. Those secret hours became her escape from the pain of the day. The mocking words from Joseph and his family replayed in her mind, but instead of breaking her, they fueled her. Each insult became a push to learn more, to prepare more, to dream harder. She knew she could not fight them with her voice, but maybe one day she could fight them with her success. In the quiet of the night, Amina was no longer the plain wife who was laughed at. She was a dreamer, a student, and a builder of something bigger than herself. No one else saw it yet, but in the silence, she was shaping a future that could change everything. The wedding was the kind of event people in Mombasa talked about for weeks. Joseph's cousin was marrying into another wealthy family, and the celebration was like something out of a movie. Expensive cars lined the streets, their polished bodies gleaming under the sun. The hall was decorated with flowers so fresh they still carried morning dew, and golden chandeliers sparkled above tables covered in white linen. Women wore flowing gowns stitched with sequin, their jewelry catching every ray of light. Men strutted in sharp suits and polished shoes, laughing loudly and showing off their watches. And then there was Amina. She had spent hours ironing her best kitenge dress, one she had saved for special occasion. It was simple but neat, paired with a headscarf she had tied carefully in front of her mirror. She knew it was not as flashy as what Joseph's sisters or cousins would wear, but it was all she had. She walked beside Joseph quietly, her eyes lowered, holding on to the hope that maybe this time, the family would be kinder. But as soon as she entered the hall, the whispers began. Women turned their heads, smirks tugging at their painted lips. Joseph's sisters nudged each other, pretending to admire her dress in exaggerated voices. "Wow, so simple. Is that really what she wore to such a big wedding?" Laughter followed, soft but sharp enough for Amina to feel it piercing her skin. At the dining table, someone murmured, "Even the housemaids dress better than this." The words burned in her ears, but she kept her gaze fixed on her plate, willing herself not to cry. Joseph noticed too, but instead of standing by her, he leaned close and whispered something that crushed her heart. "You'll never fit in with this family," he said, his tone filled with shame and disgust. The words cut deeper than any laughter in the room. It wasn't just strangers mocking her, it was her own husband, the man who was supposed to defend her. In that moment, surrounded by music, dancing, and flashing cameras, Amina felt like she was standing alone in the middle of a storm. She sat through the wedding like a ghost. When others danced, she stayed in her chair. When others clapped, she only folded her hands in her lap. Every cheer and laugh around her made her feel smaller, invisible, almost erased. She thought about leaving, but where would she go? She didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't want to give them another reason to laugh. So she endured it, smiling faintly when someone looked her way, even though her heart was breaking inside. That night, when the lights were off and Joseph snored peacefully beside her, Amina lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her chest felt heavy, as if the laughter from the wedding was still echoing inside her. But beneath the pain, something else was stirring. A voice inside her whispered that this could not go on forever. She thought about the notebook hidden in her trunk, filled with dreams of a skincare brand. She thought about the herbs her grandmother had taught her to use, about the business tutorials she had watched in secret, about the spark she felt every time she imagined a different future. Lying in the dark, Amina made a vow to herself. She would no longer allow humiliation to define her life. She would no longer let Joseph's words or his family's mockery be the final truth about who she was. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but she knew one thing with certainty: she would rise. One day, the same people who laughed at her kitenge dress would have no choice but to see her worth. And that silent promise became the seed of her transformation. The first step came quietly, almost like a secret prayer. One morning, when Joseph had left for work and the house was still, Amina took out her old trunk and pulled out the notebook she had been filling for months. She opened a page where she had written a simple recipe: soap made with coconut oil, aloe vera, and neem leaves, just as her grandmother once taught her. Her hands trembled a little as she gathered the ingredients, but her heart beat with determination. She mixed, stirred, and poured the mixture into small molds she had fashioned from used plastic containers. When they dried, she held the bars in her hands like they were gold. They weren't perfect, but they were hers. The following week, Amina traveled to Lama Town, a place known for its busy open-air markets where tourists and locals walked shoulder to shoulder. She carried a small basket with only a few bars of soap wrapped in brown paper. She set them neatly on a corner of a wooden stall that an old neighbor allowed her to share. At first, she felt invisible. People passed by without stopping, rushing to buy fish, fruits, and spices. But then one curious woman paused, picked up a bar, and asked softly, "What's this?" Amina explained, her voice shy but steady. "It's natural soap. Coconut oil, aloe vera, neem leaves. All from here." The woman sniffed the bar, smiled, and handed her a few coins. That single sale lit a spark inside Amina. Soon another person stopped. Then another. Some bought out of curiosity, others because they liked the soft herbal scent. By the end of the day, her basket was almost empty. She walked home with a few folded notes in her purse and a feeling she had never experienced before: freedom, even if just a small taste. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. Women who struggled with skin rashes came asking for the plain lady's soap. Mothers loved that it was gentle for their children. Tourists were drawn to its natural charm, often buying more than one to take home. People praised the way it left their skin soft and fresh. Each compliment fed Amina's courage. She made a decision that night. Every shilling she earned would go back into the business. She bought more oil, more herbs, more paper for wrapping. She experimented with new scents: lemongrass, hibiscus, even honey. She stayed up late cutting and wrapping bars, her small kitchen filling with the warm smell of herbs and oils. But she told no one, not even Joseph. When he came home, tired and often sour, she hid her supplies and tucked her small earnings deep inside her trunk. She knew what he would say if he found out. He would laugh, mock her, maybe even stop her. So she carried her secret carefully, like a fragile flame that needed protecting from the wind. Every trip to the market made her stronger. She learned how to speak with customers, how to smile even when she was tired, how to listen to what people wanted. Slowly, her basket grew fuller, and so did her confidence. It wasn't just about soap anymore. It was about proving to herself that she could build something with her own two hands. For the first time in her life, Amina felt a sense of independence. Each coin she earned was like a piece of her dignity being restored. And though no one else knew yet, inside her heart she carried the sweetest secret: that her new life had already begun. It was bound to happen sooner or later. One evening, as Amina was carefully wrapping her last batch of soap in brown paper, Joseph walked into the kitchen earlier than usual. She hadn't heard him come in. The door creaked, and there he was, standing with his arms crossed, watching her. The smell of herbs and oils filled the room, and the table was scattered with small bars waiting to dry. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Amina's hands froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What's all this?" Joseph asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. He picked up one of the soaps, turning it over in his hand like it was something useless. Amina tried to explain softly. "It's soap. I've been making them, selling some at the market in Lamu. People like them. It helps me." Before she could finish, Joseph burst into laughter. Not the kind of laughter that came from joy, but the cruel kind that stabbed deep. "Soap? You've been wasting your time making this nonsense." He shook his head, still laughing. "Do you really think selling soap will change anything? You won't even make enough to buy a chicken, let alone a house." The words stung like a slap. Amina lowered her eyes, her hands tightening around the brown paper she was holding. She felt her throat tighten, but she swallowed her tears before they could escape. She had heard his mockery many times before, but this one hurt more, because it was aimed at the one thing that gave her hope. Joseph tossed the bar of soap back on the table carelessly, as if it had no value. "You embarrass me," he muttered, pacing the kitchen. My family already laughs at you, and now you want to stand in the market like some poor woman selling scraps? Stop this nonsense before people find out. Do you want everyone to know my wife is a market vendor? Amina wanted to scream, to defend herself, to tell him that those small bars of soap were more than just scraps. They were her dream, her lifeline, her silent fight for dignity. But she said nothing. She had learned long ago that answering back only fueled his cruelty. So she stayed quiet, standing still as his words rained down like stone. That night, when Joseph had gone to bed grumbling about her foolish hobby, Amina sat alone in the kitchen. She looked at the soaps neatly wrapped and stacked in her basket. She touched them gently, as though they were fragile children needing her protection. His words replayed in her mind. Not even enough to buy a chicken. She let the pain wash over her, but she did not let it drown her. Deep inside, she whispered to herself, one day, these soaps will buy more than a chicken. One day, they will buy me freedom. The next morning, she rose earlier than usual. She packed her basket and walked to the market with her head held a little higher. The same customers greeted her warmly, praising her products, handing her coins with smiles that Joseph had never given her. Each sale was like a small victory, a reminder that Joseph's words were only noise. In her silence, Amina found her strength. She did not fight him with argument. She fought with action, with persistence, with every bar of soap she sold. Joseph thought his laughter could break her, but he didn't know that every insult was turning into fuel. And while he mocked her dream, she carried it carefully, knowing the day would come when the world, not Joseph, would decide her worth. It happened on a day that began like any other. Amina set up her basket in the busy llama market, arranging her soaps neatly on a small cloth. The sun was hot, and the air smelled of spices and roasted fish. She had grown used to the rhythm of the market. Some days were good, some days were slow. But that day, fate walked in wearing a wide hat and carrying a camera. A tourist from South Africa stopped at her little stall. She was a woman in her 40s, curious and warm, with eyes that noticed everything. She picked up one of Amina's soaps and held it close, breathing in the herbal scent. This smells amazing, she said. What's in it? Shy but steady, Amina explained. Coconut oil, neem leaves, aloe vera, sometimes hibiscus or lemongrass. These are recipes my grandmother taught me. The tourist's face lit up. Natural, handmade, and from African herbs? Do you know how big this could be? At first, Amina thought she was just being polite. But the woman bought several bars, then asked for Amina's phone number. I own a boutique chain back home in South Africa, she explained. I think your soaps could sell very well. Send me samples and let's see. Amina's hands shook as she wrote down her number on a piece of paper. She couldn't believe someone from another country was interested in her soaps. That night, she prayed with tears in her eyes, asking God for guidance. Weeks later, the woman kept her promise. She placed a large order, not just a few soaps, but hundreds, enough to stock her boutique stores across South Africa. For Amina, it felt like the world had suddenly opened its doors. What had started as a secret hobby in her kitchen was now being shipped beyond Kenya's borders. The orders didn't stop there. Word spread through the tourists' network, and soon more boutiques reached out. Amina found herself unable to keep up with the demand in her small kitchen. That's when she made the boldest decision of her life. She would open a small factory. With the little savings she had and the money from her first big order, she rented a modest space in her village. It wasn't fancy, just a simple building with enough room for tables, molds, and storage. But to Amina, it was more beautiful than any palace. She hired women from the community, especially widows and young mothers who struggled to make ends meet. Together, they worked side by side, mixing oils, grinding herbs, wrapping soaps, and packing boxes for shipment. For the first time, Amina was not just making soaps, she was creating jobs. The same neighbors who once pitted her now looked at her with admiration. Women in her village walked with pride, telling others, I work at Amina's factory. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the building as they worked, and Amina often paused just to take it all in, her heart swelling with gratitude. Overnight, her brand became more than a business. It became a movement. Her soaps carried the story of African herbs, of resilience, of a woman who turned silence into power. From llamas market stalls to boutique shelves in South Africa, her products were no longer just bars of soap. They were symbols of dignity. And while Joseph still scoffed, shaking his head at her little factory, Amina didn't care anymore. She had stepped into her destiny. The world had seen her worth, and now her village did too. The dream she once hid in a notebook had grown into something real, something unstoppable. Joseph was sitting in his office one afternoon, flipping through a glossy business magazine a colleague had left on his desk. He wasn't really paying attention at first, just skimming through stories about successful entrepreneurs and big companies. But then his eyes froze on a familiar face. There, on the cover of a full-page feature, was Amina, his wife. the same woman he had always called too plain. Her photo showed her standing proudly in front of shelves filled with beautifully wrapped soap bars, her headscarf neatly tied, her eyes shining with quiet confidence. Above the picture, bold letters read, Amina Yusuf, from small village to international skincare brand. For a long moment, Joseph couldn't breathe. He blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the words were clear, the image unmistakable. It was Amina, his Amina, being celebrated as a businesswoman. His chest tightened as he read the article. It spoke of her humble beginnings, her use of African herbs, her passion for empowering women in her village, and the way her products were now being sold across borders. Customers loved her brand. Investors were interested. Journalists were calling her a rising star. Joseph felt a hot wave of shame mixed with disbelief. The same wife he had mocked for selling soap in the market was now being recognized as a respected entrepreneur. The article painted her as strong, visionary, and inspiring, the complete opposite of how he had always described her to his family. That evening, the magazine's story spread quickly through the family WhatsApp group. His sisters sent screenshots, buzzing with gossip. Have you seen this? Amina in a magazine, one wrote. Another added, so she's been busy while we laughed at her. Even his mother, who had always sneered at Amina, sent a short message that carried both surprise and unease. So your wife is becoming a businesswoman? Joseph felt the walls closing in. He had spent years making Amina feel small, mocking her at every family gathering. Now suddenly, she was the one whose name was in print, while he was just her husband, the man in the background. He pictured the next family dinner, where the same relatives who once laughed at her simplicity would now whisper about how she was outshining them all. The thought gnawed at him. For years, his family had treated him with respect because he married into wealth and moved in wealthy circles. But now respect was shifting toward Amina. She was no longer the quiet woman in the corner. She was someone the world admired. He could already hear the murmurs behind his back. Joseph mocked her, but look who's the real success now. At home, Joseph tried to act normal, tossing the magazine aside when Amina walked in. She didn't even know he had seen it. She simply went about her evening, preparing dinner, her face calm as always. But for the first time, Joseph looked at her differently. He noticed the way she moved with quiet confidence, the way she no longer seemed weighed down by his word. There was a new energy around her, a strength he could no longer ignore. That night, as he lay in bed, Joseph stared at the ceiling, his pride stinging. The woman he had once belittled was stepping into a spotlight he never expected. And deep inside, fear crept in, fear that the world was beginning to see what he had always refused to, Amina's true worth. And once the world saw it, there would be no turning back. The call came on a bright Monday morning. Amina was in her small factory, overseeing the women as they wrapped soaps, when her phone rang. On the other end was a representative from a chain of luxury resorts spread across Africa and the Middle East. They had seen her products in boutiques, heard the rave reviews from tourists, and wanted her to be their official supplier. It wasn't a small order. It was a multi-million-dollar deal, soaps, creams, and oils for every room in every resort. For a moment, Amina held the phone tightly, her breath caught in her throat. She had dreamed of opportunities like this, but now it was real. The first thing she did was whisper a prayer of gratitude. She thought of her grandmother's herbs, of the nights spent scribbling in secret notebooks, of the laughter that once made her feel so small. And now here she was, standing in the middle of her factory, with women clapping and cheering when she shared the news. The deal meant expansion, more jobs, more lives changed. But for Amina, it also meant something deeper, proof that her simplicity had become her strength. With the new contract in hand, she had to visit the bank to finalize the transactions. It was the very same bank where Joseph once mocked her in front of the staff, sneering that she didn't even belong there. She remembered the humiliation like it had happened yesterday, the stares, the smirks, the sting of his words. But this time, Amina walked indifferently. She wasn't the quiet wife trailing behind her husband. She walked through the glass doors as a CEO, dressed in a crisp outfit, her headscarf tied elegantly, her company's name on official documents. The staff who once ignored her now rose to greet her with smiles and respect. She sat across from the bank manager, who shook her hand firmly. "It's an honor to work with you, Madam Amina," he said. The words warmed her heart. She signed the papers with steady hands, her name flowing boldly across the line. When she left the bank, her steps felt lighter than ever before. She had turned her pain into power, and the same place that once humiliated her now bowed to her success. But the story didn't end there. With the deal secured, Amina made another bold decision, one that carried deep meaning. She purchased a mansion. Not just any mansion, but the very grand house Joseph's family had once flaunted in front of her, the one they said she would never deserve. It stood tall with gleaming windows, iron gates, and a garden so wide it looked like a park. She remembered the day she had stood outside its walls years ago, feeling small as Joseph's relatives boasted about their Now those gates opened for her. The day she got the keys, Amina walked slowly through each room. Marble floors stretched under her feet, chandeliers sparkled above her, and wide balconies overlooked the ocean. But what touched her most wasn't the luxury, it was the symbolism. This house was no longer a symbol of what she lacked. It was a symbol of what she had built. Every corner of it whispered the story of her struggle, her silence, her resilience. Standing in the grand living room, Amina smiled to herself. She didn't buy the mansion to boast or to compete. She bought it as a reminder that no amount of mockery can stop a determined spirit. The house was proof that simplicity, patience, and quiet strength could build empires. And now, the mansion that once made her feel unworthy was hers to call home. The night of the family gathering was one everyone had been waiting for, though none of them knew how unforgettable it would be. Joseph's family had planned a grand dinner, inviting cousins, uncles, and family friends. They wanted to meet in style, to show off once again as they always did. But what they didn't know was that the venue they had chosen, the mansion they admired so much, no longer belonged to them. It now belonged to Amina. The evening began with cars pulling up to the gates one after another. Expensive sedans and SUVs lined the driveway as Joseph's relatives stepped out in glittering gowns and polished shoes. They chatted loudly, taking photos by the grand entrance, admiring the tall pillars and the wide garden. "Ah, this house," one of the sisters said proudly. "It's the jewel of the family." None of them noticed the small, knowing smile on Amina's lips as she watched from inside. When the doors opened, Amina stood at the center of the wide hallway, dressed simply but with a quiet elegance that needed no jewel. The chandeliers above lit her face, and for once, everyone's eyes turned toward her, not with mockery, but with confusion. They weren't used to seeing her stand so firmly, her head held so high. "Welcome," Amina said softly, her voice carrying strength that filled the room. She paused for a moment, then let the words fall like thunder. "Welcome to my home. The one your son mocked me for never deserving." The room went silent. Forks hovered in midair. Conversation stopped. Joseph's mother blinked rapidly, as though she hadn't heard correctly. His sisters exchanged stunned glances, their painted smiles faltering. Even Joseph froze, his face stiff with shock. No one had expected this. Amina continued, her tone steady. "This house is no longer yours to flaunt. It is mine. Every brick, every wall, every light in this place was paid for by the business you all laughed at. The soap you called nonsense, the dream you mocked, I turned it into this." She gestured around the room, her words slicing through the silence. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of triumph. For years she had endured their cruelty, their laughter, their insults that cut her spirit. And now, standing in the very mansion that once made her feel small, she reclaimed her worth in front of them all. The silence was heavy. No one dared speak. Joseph's mother lowered her gaze, shame washing over her face. His sisters, who once mocked her dresses and her simplicity, now fidgeted with their jewelry, unable to meet her eyes. Even the cousins who had laughed behind her back sat frozen, their pride crumbling. Joseph tried to clear his throat, forcing a smile. "Now wait, Amina," but she raised her hand, silencing him with a calmness that cut deeper than anger. "For years, I was treated like I was nothing. You made me feel invisible. But while you laughed, I was building. While you mocked, I was working. And now, this house is mine. Not because I wanted to prove anything to you, but because I refused to let your cruelty define me." Her voice broke slightly, but her eyes remained steady. "Tonight, you sit here as my guests. Not to mock me, not to belittle me, but to witness what patience and faith can build." The room stayed quiet, the weight of her words sinking into every heart. No laughter, no whispers, only silence and shame. And for the first time, Amina was not the simple wife they mocked. She was the woman who owned the mansion, the woman who had turned her pain into power. And they could do nothing but sit in her home and face the truth. Joseph couldn't stand the silence that had filled the mansion that evening. The shame on his family's faces burned into him, and he felt the weight of being overshadowed by the very woman he had always mocked. So, in desperation, he tried to twist the story. Clearing his throat, he forced a smile and said, "Well, of course, Amina has done well. But let's not forget I guided her. Without me, she wouldn't be here. I gave her the support and vision to reach this level." His words hung awkwardly in the air. A few relatives nodded politely, but most knew the truth. They remembered his constant laughter at her expense, the whispers about how he called her too plain and useless. Still, Joseph pressed on, his voice louder now, almost desperate. "Yes, this business may be under her name, but we all know marriage is partnership. What's hers is mine, and what's mine is hers. So really, this is our success." Amina stayed calm, though inside she could feel the old sting of his arrogance. But this time, she didn't remain silent. She walked to a small table where her files were neatly stacked and picked up a folder. Without raising her voice, she placed it in front of the family. "Here," she said. These are the business papers, the registrations, the contracts, the bank accounts. Every single one is under my name. Joseph has never invested a shilling, never signed a contract, never lifted a hand in this journey. The room went still again. One of Joseph's sisters hesitated, flipping through the documents, her face paling as she saw Amina's name stamped boldly on every page. His mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting from the papers to Joseph's face. The truth was undeniable. Joseph tried to laugh it off. Paperwork doesn't show everything. Of course, I advised her. But Amina cut him off gently, her voice firm. Advised me? You mocked me. You told me soap wouldn't buy a chicken. You told me I'd never fit in with your family. You told me to stop before people laughed at you. That was your advice. Her words landed like stones, each one pulling Joseph further down. The family looked at him differently now, not as the proud son who had married a simple woman, but as the husband who had tried to crush her dreams while she quietly built an empire. His sisters exchanged glances, their eyes filled with disappointment. His mother sighed heavily, shaking her head as if she had just seen her son for who he truly was. For the first time in his life, Joseph had nothing to say. The mask of pride he wore so confidently began to crumble. He sat slumped in his chair, his hands clenched, his face red with anger and humiliation. The family's silence spoke louder than words. They no longer saw him as the successful one. They saw him as the failure, the man who had been handed everything but achieved nothing, the man whose wife had surpassed him without his help. That night, Joseph felt something he had never felt before: fear. Fear of being forgotten in his own family's eyes. Fear of being remembered not as the strong husband, but as the man who tried to bury a woman's light and ended up being blinded by it. His downfall wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, written across the faces of the people who no longer admired him. In the shadow of Amina's success, Joseph had finally become what he always feared: irrelevant. Amina stood in the middle of the grand dining room, her eyes moving slowly across the faces of Joseph's family. They were still seated, stunned by the truth she had laid bare. Joseph sat in silence, his pride shattered, while his sisters fidgeted with their rings and avoided her gaze. His mother, once so sharp with her tongue, now stared at the tablecloth as though the patterns could hide her shame. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Amina drew in a deep breath. Her voice was calm, steady, but filled with a power they had never heard from her. You mocked my simplicity, she began, her eyes fixed on Joseph's mother. You called me plain, dull, not good enough for this family. You laughed at my clothes, at my silence, at my way of life. But what you called weakness was actually my strength. While you laughed, I worked. While you mocked, I dreamed. While you tried to make me small, I was building something bigger than all of us. Her words floated through the room like arrows, striking each heart. She turned slightly, her gaze moving to Joseph's sisters. Do you remember the dinners where you gave me leftovers? Where you treated me like a servant in my own marriage? You thought my silence meant I accepted your cruelty. But I was simply saving my voice for the right moment. And tonight, this is my voice. Joseph shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Amina did not look at him. She lifted her chin, her face glowing with quiet dignity. Every bar of soap I made carried my grandmother's wisdom, carried the heritage of our land. What you mocked as useless was the very thing that lifted me to where I stand today. You thought simplicity was a cage, but simplicity was my weapon. It taught me patience, discipline, and faith. The women in the room could no longer hold her gaze. One by one, their heads lowered, as though they were bowing before the truth. The same mouths that once laughed at her now had no words. Their jewelry, their flashy clothes, their loud laughter. None of it could cover the shame they felt in that moment. Amina's eyes softened, but her voice stayed strong. I could stand here and seek revenge. I could throw your insults back at you. But that is not who I am. My journey was never about proving you wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was right to believe in me. And I did. Her words carried no anger, only power. Power that came from endurance, from years of quiet suffering transformed into triumph. She looked around the mansion, her mansion, and then back at them. You see these walls, this home, this success? None of it was born from hatred. It was born from love. Love for my grandmother's teachings. Love for the women in my village who now work with me. Love for the dream you all thought was too small to matter. And yet, here we are. Joseph's sisters wiped at their eyes, ashamed. His mother pressed her lips together, unable to argue. Even Joseph sat frozen, his eyes downcast. For the first time, Amina's voice was the only one that mattered in that family. And it wasn't because she shouted the loudest. It was because she had lived the truth they could no longer deny. She had turned mockery into motivation, silence into strength, and simplicity into greatness. And in that moment, she no longer stood as the wife they had belittled. She stood as the woman who had risen above them all. The mansion was everything Joseph's family had once flaunted before Amina, a symbol of wealth, power, and status. But when Amina finally owned it, she did not see it the way they did. To her, it wasn't just about marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, or the wide gates that opened with a soft hum. To her, this mansion was proof that dreams could grow even in the darkest corners of life. It was a seed of hope, and she refused to keep it just for herself. Soon after she moved in, the quiet halls of the house began to fill with life. Not with endless parties or showy gatherings, but with the sound of women's voices. Young women from villages around Mombasa, Lamu, and even further. They came carrying notebooks, worn sandals, shy smiles, and big dreams. Amina welcomed them warmly, not as a wealthy businesswoman showing off her home, but as a sister who understood their struggles. She turned one wing of the mansion into a learning space. The long dining table that once hosted Joseph's proud family dinners now held rows of young women scribbling notes as Amina spoke about business, budgeting, branding, and self-reliance. The living room, with its tall ceilings and golden curtains, became a workshop space where women experimented with soaps, oils, and other products, just as Amina once did late at night in her small kitchen. When she stood before them, Amina never used complicated words. She spoke in simple, clear language. You don't need a big start. You don't need people to clap for you. You need courage, and you need to keep going, even when people laugh. The women listened, some with tears in their eyes, because her story felt like their own. Word spread quickly. The plain wife, who had once been mocked, was now known across Kenya as the woman lifting others. Newspapers began covering her workshops, calling the mansion a house of empowerment. Social media buzzed with photos of young women holding up their first products. Jars of shea buttercream, bottles of coconut oil, small soap bars, all stamped with proud smiles and the caption, "Mentored by Amina." But Amina didn't stop at teaching business skill. She taught dignity. She told them, never let anyone decide your worth. Not a husband, not a family, not society. Your worth is in your hands and in your work. Her words spread like fire in their hearts, and many of them went back to their villages not just as learners, but as leaders. Soon, her workshops grew into a full movement. Women began forming groups, pooling resources, and starting small ventures of their own. Some opened food stalls, some sold handmade baskets, some created skincare products inspired by their heritage. Each time one of them succeeded, they remembered the mansion where it all began, the place that showed them possibility. For Amina, watching them succeed was more precious than the mansion itself. She often stood at the gates, watching the young women leave after a workshop, their faces glowing with excitement, and she felt a deep peace. This house was no longer a trophy. It was a seedbed for many more dreams. The same walls that once echoed with Joseph's cruel whispers now carried the laughter and determination of women who refused to be silenced. And in that, the mansion had found its true meaning, not as a monument to wealth, but as a home where broken voices found strength, and where simplicity grew into power that could never again be mocked. Joseph had never felt smaller in his life. For years, he had laughed at Amina, mocked her dreams, and treated her like she would never amount to anything. Now, the same woman he had belittled was a name celebrated across the country, a businesswoman featured in magazines, and the owner of the mansion he once bragged his family on. Every corner of her success reminded him of his failure, and the weight of it was unbearable. One evening, he showed up at the mansion gates, looking tired and desperate. He was no longer the proud man who once walked with his head high, boasting of his family's wealth. His shoulders were bent, his clothes less polished, his eyes restless. The guards at the gate hesitated, unsure if they should let him in, but Amina, always graceful, allowed him to step inside. When Joseph entered the living room, he paused. The walls that once heard his cruel words now glowed with a different energy, warmth, laughter, and life. Photos of Amina at conferences, surrounded by smiling women she had mentored, lined the walls. A large award plaque hung above the mantel. Everything spoke of her triumph, and none of it carried his name. He sank into the chair across from her, his voice trembling. "Amina," he began, "I was wrong. I see it now. I never believed in you, and yet, look at what you've built. Please give me another chance. I can change. I can be the husband you deserve." His words hung in the air, desperate and broken, but Amina's face stayed calm. She looked at him with eyes that once held pain but now carried only strength. For a long time, she didn't speak. Joseph fidgeted, waiting, hoping. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "Joseph," she said softly, "you never saw my worth. All those years, you laughed at me, mocked me, made me feel less. You stood by when your family humiliated. You told me I would never fit in. And now you come here, after the world has seen what you refused to see, asking for a second chance." Joseph lowered his head, ashamed, but she continued, her tone steady and firm. "I do not hate you. I carry no revenge in my heart. But I am no longer the woman who once begged for your kindness. I found strength in the very simplicity you mocked. I found dignity in my silence, and I found power in my dreams. I don't need your approval anymore. The world sees me now. More importantly, I see myself." Her words hit Joseph harder than any insult could. They were not angry, they were final. He looked up, tears in his eyes. "So this is it. You're leaving me behind," he whispered. Amina shook her head gently. "I am not leaving you behind, Joseph. You left me long ago, when you chose to stand with those who mocked me instead of standing with. I am only moving forward. And where I am going, I cannot carry the weight of your doubt and your pride." Joseph's tears spilled freely, but Amina did not waver. She rose from her chair, her voice soft but unshakable. "You never saw my worth. Now the world does. And more importantly, I do." With that, she turned and walked away, her steps steady, her heart free. Joseph sat in silence, realizing too late that the woman he once underestimated had become untouchable, not because of her wealth, but because of her strength. And no plea could undo that truth. The sun was setting behind the tall gates of the mansion, casting a golden glow on the place that had once been nothing but a dream. Amina stood there with a calm smile, not dressed in glittering clothes or trying to impress anyone, but in her usual simple way that had always been her strength. Beside her stood dozens of women, some young, some older, all of them women who once felt small, mocked, or overlooked the way she had been. Today, they weren't just standing at her gates to admire. They were standing there because they now had jobs, opportunities, and dignity through the business Amina had built. The same gates that once closed her out of respect now opened wide to welcome others. Amina shook hands, hugged women who thanked her through tears, and handed out the first employment letters for her expanding company. Each smile, each word of gratitude, was more valuable to her than all the wealth inside the mansion. Someone captured the moment on camera, a simple woman in front of a grand house, lifting others with. Within hours, the picture spread across social media with a powerful caption, "From simple wife to mansion owner." People across the world shared her story, inspired by how she turned pain into power, mockery into motivation, and simplicity into greatness. The message was clear, and it echoed everywhere. Never underestimate simplicity. It might just buy your mansion one day. Amina didn't just own a mansion, she owned her story, and now it belonged to every woman who ever doubted herself.